Welcome to this session of Kaiju Masterclass. I'm Steve Ryfle, and I'm really pleased to welcome Allison Adams and Pat Saperstein to talk about the adventures of Nick Adams and Henry G. Saperstein in Japan in the 1960s. Henry Saperstein produced, of course, several films with Toho, including Frankenstein Conquers the World and Monster Zero, which both starred Nick Adams. And we're going to hopefully dive a little deeper into the human stories behind these two men who are so influential in the history of this genre, who are big favorites in the terms of their contributions to the films that we love so much. And I just want to welcome both Allison Adams and Pat. If you would do me indulge me a bit, I'd like to introduce the both of you, just to give a little bit of your background. Allison Adams is an award-winning costume designer, screenwriter, playwright, educator, and activist. She's had numerous plays produced in both Los Angeles and in Montana, where she now resides. In 2005, she produced and starred in Peace is a Woman's Job, a PBS documentary, a docudrama about Montana's first congresswoman, and she toured with a production of that as a one-woman show for many years. She recently published a book, which we'll talk about, called The Rebel and the King, which was written by her father, Nick Adams, which is about his friendship with the great Elvis Presley. Pat Saperstein is a deputy editor of the entertainment industry publication Variety, where she oversees breaking news, obituaries, restaurants, books, and film. She started her career as the U.S. editor of the Film Francais. She has an extensive background in international and independent film and documentaries, and she's contributed 2 books, including Con, 50 Years of Sun, Sex, and Celluloid. She maintained a long-time blog about the LA restaurant scene called Eating LA, and she was once called the ground dam of food blogging by the LA Weekly. So welcome to you both. Thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I would like to start by asking both of you to tell us about your dads, who they were as people, and if possible, to try to get a sense of where Nick and Henry were in terms of career and life in the early 1960s, which would have been just about a few years before their paths crossed. I would say, Patrick, can we have the first or the second slide in our deck? And Pat, I'm going to ask you to maybe take the ball first. This is, of course, Henry having lunch or dinner with Lee Marvin, and a shot of him with Woody Allen while working on What's Up, Tiger, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Right. So those were both films that my dad produced that were also associated with Japan and Toho. Hell in the Pacific starred Toshiro Mifune along with Lee Marvin, and he went out to the island of Palau in the South Pacific to shoot it. I think this photo was probably taken in Guam or Palau when they were shooting. And the other photo is, of course, from What's Up, Tiger Lily, which was based on a Toho film as well. So, he became associated with the Japanese producers after he bought the animation studio UPA. And that was the studio that owned Mr. Magoo and Dick Tracy cartoons. And he bought that in around 1960 and, started production of some new Mr. Magoo cartoons. But then he wanted some additional programming to sell to the TV stations and ended up going to Japan and making deals for some packages of films from Toho. And that was how he became involved as a producer as well.
Now let's see the next slide. You mentioned Mr. Magoo. And of course, UPA also had Gerald McBoing Boing, the kid who makes a lot of funny noises when he tries to speak. So what I know of Henry's story is that in much of what you said, he purchased UPA. I think that was in, did you say 1959?
Around 1959.
Yeah. And they took those theatrical cartoon shorts and basically tried to turn them into, they turned them into television content because television was booming. And at some point, he decided to get into feature films. And one of the early things that he produced was the animated feature Gay Paris, with Robert Goulet and Judy Garland. So, and let's see the next slide, Patrick. I wanted to, geez, I'm having trouble with mine. So, Allison, if you could kind of tell us, a little background about where your dad was at this time. We're talking early '60s. Obviously, we're jumping ahead in the photo because I love this photo. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that as well.
Well, my father had starred in his own television series in 1959 and 1960 called The Rebel, and it was produced by A.J. Fennedy and created by both himself and A.J. Fennedy. And it was quite popular, and then it went off the air. And then my father did other television shows and films. And he had been nominated for an Academy Award for Twilight of Honor with Richard Chamberlain and Joey Heatherton in 1964. Dates are always not my strength. And there's a story, he was nominated for the Academy Award, but then his part was cut out of the movie, and he didn't win. So he was quite disappointed with that. And after that, some of it, some of his movie work slowed down. And then that's when he traveled to Japan and also to England to work with Boris Karloff on, oh gosh, what's that name? Anyway, so as a little girl, I remember going to Japan when he worked on Monster Zero and Frankenstein Conquers the World. And Japan was a whirlwind for us because he was so popular that everywhere we went, people were taking photographs and really giving him the movie star treatment.
Well, we're going to get into that. I should say part of this presentation, we're going to look at some wonderful photos together, and hopefully they will spark some conversation and memories of the two of these individuals in Japan. Frankly, I found a lot more of Nick than we did of Henry, but we do have some pictures of Henry in Japan working on these productions as well. And pretty excited. I hope there's a few that maybe you haven't seen before. Can we have the next slide, please? So yeah, these are some of the productions that Allison was talking about. Looks like Nick had his own comic book there for a while with the popularity of the TV show. Twilight of Honor was a courtroom drama with Richard Chamberlain. Courtroom dramas were, of course, very popular at the time with the 12 Angry Men and Judgment at Nuremberg and films like that being very successful. So yeah, Nick had gone through this sort of, as far as what I understand, he was born in 1931, is that right?
Yes.
And he was born in Pennsylvania, working class. The story is, and I don't know, you can correct me because I know there's the studio publicity machines in those days they came up with a good story. But the story was that he came from a coal mining family, and that he eventually worked his way out to California and worked very hard to become an actor. And yes, there's actually you mentioned you mentioned the incident or the story around his nomination for Twilight of Honor. There actually was, and I don't again know how accurate it was, but there was a story in the trade papers at the time around his enthusiasm for. I think the idea was that he was very convinced that he was going to win, and so he was actually like rehearsing, receiving the trophy by going to the auditorium. In those days, they did the Academy Awards at the Santa Monica Civic, believe it or not. And he got there sometime early and was rehearsing his walk up to the stage, which I don't know how true that is, but it's a fascinating story.
Well, it's true.
Yeah.
My mother told me that story, and they were the first ones at the Academy Awards, and 3 hours early. And my mother was wearing a dress from the Unsinkable Molly Brown that she got from Western Costume. And he was running up and down the aisles, rehearsing, getting his Academy Award. And when he didn't win, in one of those movie guidebooks, I mean, it was Melvin Douglas won instead. And I guess the look on my father's face was quite memorable. And he lost, but his good friends, Robert Conrad and John Ashley and Perry Lopez, they ended up giving him the Top of the World Award because of that Cagney movie. My dad wanted to stand on the stage and say, "I'm on top of the world, Ma." So they gave him the On Top of the World Award. It's also funny that he was quite the character. And even though he was an actor, he was quite the PR magician, I think. Jay Bernstein always said he learned everything from my dad, who was also a public relations manager, producer. And he told the story of how my father would deliver a press release on horseback down Wilshire Boulevard just to get some publicity. And so he basically got nominated because he called up everybody in the guild and the academy and really lobbied for it. Oops. And then when he lost, it was kind of, people were a little disappointed because his part was cut out of the movie.
Was his personality like, he has this sort of larger than life aura, reputation, I guess. Was he like that at home and in your personal life with him?
Yes. He liked to play classical music and movie soundtracks very loud all the time. He was always going somewhere. He was always taking us somewhere. I learned very early of who had the camera and how to smile and sort of a Hollywood childhood. He loved his publicity. And he was somebody that always liked to keep his promises, because a lot of times in the movies, he would make promises and then he wouldn't be able to keep them. And he'd feel bad afterwards. So, he'd show up and say, "I know I told you I'd take you horseback riding. Let's drive to Beaumont right now." Things like that.
And let's look at the next slide, because a lot of this ties into exactly what we're talking about. So the point at which Nick and Henry, their careers intersect is with the production of Frankenstein Conquers the World, which came out in 1965. This is a project that actually iterated a number of times at Toho. It actually started as it really starts with going all the way back to a film called King Kong versus Godzilla, which was an evolution of a project that started in America called King Kong versus Frankenstein. And by the time it got to Japan, it eventually became King Kong versus Godzilla. But this idea of having Frankenstein in a Toho movie went through a number of iterations. But there was actually a version of it on paper called Frankenstein versus Godzilla. But as Pat, as you were saying, when Henry became interested in making films, the story that he told my friend Stuart Galbraith, who wrote a really great interview article for Film Facts magazine with Henry some years ago now, the story that Henry told was that he, as you said, his people told him they needed sci-fi action monster movies for television, right? Because they were primarily in the television business at that time. So he went to the Margaret Herrick Library, which is the Academy of Motion Pictures research library. And at that time, Margaret Herrick was the librarian, and the story he told was that he went in and asked her, who makes, great, sci-fi monster pictures overseas? And I believe he was asking specifically about overseas productions because they would be less expensive. And she told him to get in touch with either Hammer in England or Toho in Japan. And he thought he knew some history of Hammer and that they were difficult to work with. So he went and did some research. I love this part of the story, by the way. He said that he did a couple of things. One of them was that he went and took Japanese courses at UCLA Extension, both in language and culture, and I guess business practices, which is wonderful. People do this stuff all the time now, but to hear someone doing this, 50 some years ago, is just really forward thinking. And then he also went to the old Toho La Brea Theater in Los Angeles, which has been gone for many years, but for many years that was a cinema catering to the Japanese American community in Los Angeles, and Toho Studios would bring their pictures over and show them there, their Toshiro Mifune pictures and all that sort of thing. And he said that he went there and watched a Godzilla film, and this is key because I think this is one of the big influences that Henry has had over this franchise and this genre. He says that when he watched the picture, it was one of the early ones where Godzilla's mean, but he felt like people in the audience were rooting for Godzilla. So when he got a chance to meet with Toho, he encouraged them. He said, you know, you can really open up the American market, I think, if you make Godzilla more of a hero. You know, he may have embellished that story somewhat, but I wondered if you could speak to that in the sense that how does that relate to his personality and his, you know, to go into the studio that's making these films and say, in a sense, hey, you're not doing it right. I can help you make it better. I think that takes a lot of guts.
Yeah, I think all of these stories might be a little embellished because, you know, like Nick, he was a bit of a showman who liked to spin a good story. So I don't really have factual knowledge of any of this, and some of the parts about the UCLA class and stuff seem a little hard to imagine him sitting in a class at UCLA while he was running around the country on business trips. But sure, he was fascinated with Japanese customs, and he was really interested in getting it right so that he could relate to the Japanese business people, you know, on the right level and not make any gaffes or embarrass himself. So he was definitely interested in that. And, you know, I think it's possible he was trying to bring in new elements, sure, that would appeal more to the American audience. But as far as the details, hard to say how much of that is embellished.
Well, I can imagine him being, you know, also larger than life. I don't know if I ever told you, but when I was working on my first book about this type of film, I was able to go to his office, and I think it was Studio City or Sherman Oaks in the Valley in the 90s. And he sat with me for about an hour and a half, 2 hours for an interview. And during the entire or most of the lengthy interview, he smoked probably the biggest cigar I've ever seen. I mean, this thing was like a redwood tree, and it was great. I mean, it was so mogul-like. I just thought it was perfect. And he was very, very helpful to me. And I called him several times after. And, you know, how many studio heads, or, you know, even if it's a smaller, but he would answer the phone and talk to you on the phone. He was a really friendly guy. He was really interested in Godzilla because it was a big part of his career. So one thing I want to say, and if we go back to the slide deck, these are the theatrical posters for Frankenstein Conquers the World. Monster Zero, we'll talk about in a minute, was made in 1965, but it wasn't released theatrically in the United States. It was released, at the time in Japan, but the American version of that film with Nick was not released until 1970, after Nick had passed away. But we'll get to that later. But both Henry and Nick, part of the reason they were able to come together was due to the phenomenon of runaway production. We talked about how Henry was looking for productions overseas because it was cheaper to make things over there. That was a big deal in Hollywood in the 1950s, and especially in the 1960s. A big percentage of Hollywood films were being shot overseas, and that was controversial because the Hollywood unions were losing out. The unions were up in arms about this because jobs were being lost. And Nick Adams actually spoke out in the early 60s. I wish I had the date with me, but he actually was quoted in the newspaper saying that he would not shoot a movie overseas, that he thought it was wrong and that it was killing, you know, the Hollywood economy. And I think it speaks to, you know, the reality of the times and the availability of jobs and maybe the trajectory of his career, that he eventually, and within just a couple of years, decided that that this was the way to go. And I'll have to say, and we'll talk about this as we look at some pictures in a moment, Nick, I am the co-author with Ed Gazuchewski of a biography of Ishiro Honda, the director of these two films, or these three films that are shown here, and many, many other Japanese giant monster films. Nick was the first American actor to come over and do this kind of work. Russ Tamblyn followed, Rhodes Reason followed. Joseph Cotten was in one of Honda's films, along with Cesar Romero. I mean, they were bringing a lot of people over in the late 60s. Nick, we interviewed a lot when we were researching our book. We went to Japan about 10 years ago and interviewed assistant directors, actors, other people who worked on these films. They all loved Nick. Nick, not only because he was a nice guy and all that sort of thing, but because he took the work seriously. You know, he wasn't there just to have a good time. He was having a good time, but he wasn't just there to have a good time. They really appreciated his work ethic. The other actors, I swear to goodness, Russ Tamblyn has been quoted, Joseph Cotton has been quoted, and Rose Reason have been quoted, all basically saying they took the job on those films for the free trip to Japan, because going to Japan back then was a lot different and more exotic than it is now, and probably a lot more expensive, and they would bring their families with them and so forth. Anyway, let's look at the next slide. So this is a popular scene from Frankenstein Conquers the World. Nick plays an American physician who is in Japan treating victims of radiation in the aftermath of Hiroshima. The story of Hiroshima, one of the tragedies of it is that, you know, thousands upon thousands of people were killed when the bomb went off, but many people died slow, agonizing deaths over periods of years and decades. And this is one of the nice, interesting things about this movie is Nick is in Japan treating radiation victims, but he becomes frustrated and he's almost ready to leave because of the fact that he's not getting anywhere. He's not able to help these victims. And then this story of this Frankenstein monster appears and it becomes the focus of his work. That's Kumi Mizuno, who we should talk about at some point at the far right. She was Nick's co-star in these two films, the two main films that he made at Toho. As far as Henry Saperstein is concerned, so we talked about how the Frankenstein Conquers the World was an iteration of a project that started off as something else. When he made the deal with Toho, his deal was to put up half the, you know, at least what he said, there was some conflicting information from Toho, but that he would put up half the budget for these films, which were, I think, about the $1 million range at the time. And he also would pay to have the American star to come over, and he would bring in writers. And so Ruben Berkovich, who was a longtime collaborator of Henry's at UPA, actually wrote story drafts and scripts for a number of these projects. Let's see the next slide. Allison, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but this is Nick. This is just shows, it's a testament to his level of interest in these films. He wasn't just hanging out with his fellow stars. This is Nick with Haruo Nakajima, who played one of the monsters in Frankenstein Conquers the World. Haruo Nakajima is famous for playing Godzilla for many years. He was the original Godzilla and played it for almost 20 years. And here's Nick visiting the special effects set. Nick wasn't in the scenes with the monsters, at least not directly. And here he is hanging out with the monster guy, and that's what they really loved about him. Just jumping in feet first and becoming one of the Toho. He wasn't apart from them. He wasn't playing the ego of the big star. He actually mingled and made friendships and relationships.
Well, that's one thing that I've loved about learning more about his Japan experience is that everyone has always said such positive things about him, about how professional he was and how interested he was and friendly. And because basically he was working in Japan because he couldn't get a job in Hollywood. I mean, that's why he was there. And so I love hearing how great he was since he couldn't work in Hollywood. And I remember Mount Fuji, being in the Toho studio as a little girl and seeing that Mount Fuji, that big white triangle mountain, from the window of Toho. And the Japanese were masters at the miniature cities. And I remember the whole little town and the model. It made quite an impression on me, being around that.
That must have been so great to be able to go to Japan, and I only wish I had been able to go with him also. And also, Allison, I was wondering, you mentioned that your dad was friends with Elvis Presley, and my dad worked with Elvis Presley quite a bit. So I don't know if they might have ever encountered each other during that time. But this was in the mid to late 50s, I believe.
Well, my dad met Elvis in 1956 and was really close between 1956 and 59. So
Right. So that would have been the
that
same
might have
period.
been that might have been when they met.
Right. My dad did all of his merchandising when they first started with lipsticks and jeans and T-shirts and whatever kinds of merchandise they sold back then.
Henry was really kind of, and I wanted to bring this up at some point. So he was pretty much ahead of the curve on tie-in merchandising with film and television content and other things, celebrities. So that started, well before he was involved. I mean, we know him for the things that he merchandised with Godzilla. I remember one of the things that we talked about when I interviewed him. At that point, he was heavily involved in the video distribution and licensing of the titles for video distribution in the United States. But over the course of my childhood and lifetime, being a fan of these films, we had always looked around for merchandise. There was a board game, a Godzilla board game in the 60s, but there actually were very few items available in the United States, considering how popular Godzilla was. There was a comic book. There was I think you have the Mattel toy on the.
I do.
Yeah.
There he is. Yeah.
That was the
Right.
one where the hand actually ejects from the. I don't know why Godzilla's hand would fly off, but you'd have to go run after it and reattach it. But that was one of the main toys that was available at that time. And I remember talking to him, and he knowing that he had done work with Elvis and all kinds of other things. And he was frustrated because Toho was very limited in the number of things that they would allow him to license. And he definitely knew that Godzilla, the potential of Godzilla in the United States was far greater than what he was being able to achieve with it because of constraints put on, what he was attempting to do. I think about it now, like if he were around today, and if he saw how Godzilla has exploded in the United States, he was, I'm terribly sorry, I don't remember what year he passed, but it was before.
I believe it was 97.
Yeah, it was right before he was working with TriStar Pictures on the project for the first, American Godzilla film, which was originally going to be produced and released sometime around 1994. And it actually went into pre-production. There was a script. The director was, as you may know, a man named Jan de Bont, and the writers of they were starting out then, but they later became huge Hollywood writers, Harry Rossio and Ted Elliott, who wrote the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, and they did a lot of work at Disney. They were the writers of this script, and it was really good, and it was faithful to the Toho type of film. They eventually made one after Henry passed, which is very different. Let's take a look at the next slide. Yeah. So this is on location in Frankenstein Conquers the World on a scene on the beach. This is interesting. I wanted to talk a little bit about something else that Henry Saperstein came up with, and Nick Adams was a big part of this. The way these films were shot, the way they were able to be made. I mean, think about this. This was mind-blowing, I think, to think about that. It's, and again, forward thinking, I think. Nick Adams didn't speak Japanese, and the Japanese actors, were filming a Japanese movie. Basically, what these movies were, they were co-productions. And I neglected to say that Henry's first involvement with Toho was not Frankenstein Conquers the World. It actually was prior to that. It was a film called, in the United States, Godzilla versus the Thing, but it's actually Godzilla fighting Mothra. Mothra and Godzilla were Toho's two most famous monsters. And Mothra came out in the early 60s and was a huge, huge commercial hit in Japan. And Godzilla, of course, was a marquee monster. So in '64, Toho made a film called Mothra versus Godzilla. Henry acquired the rights to that film, the U.S. distribution rights, very quickly. And he actually worked. It's a little murky on how it exactly happened, but again, thinking about the potential for the American market, he actually had Toho. At least we think Toho. Henry was the one who had this inserted. He had Toho film an extra scene with the American military, of course, which is stationed in Japan and is there to, with the security treaty to protect Japanese territory post World War II. So a scene was inserted for American audiences only. It was not shown in Japan, showing the American military trying to rid Japan of Godzilla unsuccessfully. So that's, again, forward thinking. And Henry distributed that film in the United States through American International, because Henry did not have at that time his own distribution wing. Anyway, I wanted to just say that these films were shot with the American actor, in this case Nick, speaking in English, reading from a script that was bilingual. The Japanese actors would say their lines, and they would reply to each other in their native language. Then and they had to basically remember, this is a very rigid system. You have to remember what the translation of your scene partner's dialogue is, so that you can emote to it, react to it, appropriately. And a lot of that, actors have visual cues as well, I'm sure. But it's an ingenious way of doing this, so that when the film was distributed in America, the Japanese actors were dubbed into English, and when the film was shown in Japan, Nick was dubbed into Japanese. And this is Ishiro Honda, as I said, on the far right. That's Kumi Mizuno in the middle, and then the gentleman. This is also another interesting aspect of this. I believe the gentleman on the far left with the other gentleman in the hat is Henry Okawa. Henry Okawa is a Japanese actor who, I think that's Henry Okawa. The picture's a little small on my end. Henry Okawa was a Japanese actor who spoke fluent English. He had actually worked in the United States back in the 1930s or so. And he would not only act in these films, but he would act as the on-set interpreter. Fascinating. Did Nick ever, Allison, talk about the experience? Or, I mean, I know it's a long time ago, but of that, do you have any perspective on his working in that mode of speaking in two different languages in a scene?
I don't remember him talking about it, but I do remember working with a cinematographer that told me that Fellini never had a script when he shot. So he would just have his actors count, and then they would dub in everything later. So
yeah, this
kind of reminded me of that when you just told that story.
It's like the polar opposite, really. That's interesting. So yeah, let's see the next slide, please. So this is another scene of Honda directing Nick and Kumi Mizuno. And I believe that, again, is Henry, the translator, over there on the far left. I just wanted to show this, too. Again, we talked about Nick being just kind of ingratiating himself with his cast and the crew. He worked, and one of the myths about these productions is that they're cheap. And there was a great bias against Japan and Japanese products in the 50s and 60s. We were only, 10, 20 years removed from the war. I like to point out the song in a Japanese transistor radio, which was recorded by Alan Sherman, who was a big comedian at the time. It was a parody of the 12 Days of Christmas, but it was making fun of a Japanese product for being Japanese. It was assumed that if you bought something from Japan, it was no good. And then so when movies, like this came over from Japan, they were assumed to be no good because, in large part, they're Japanese. But in Japan, these were A-level productions. The studio, I mean, these were among the most. The Japanese movie studio in the 50s and 60s was one of the most prolific in the world, and the Japanese movie-going public was, it was the audience, and for these types of films and for commercial films in general in Japan was booming, and so big stars were in these films. And this is Kumi Mizuno was a big star, big starlet, and so was Taro Takashima, who plays a scientist in this film, but he actually appeared in a lot of comedies. And that's the other gentleman in the smock there, to the right of Nick.
One of the things I remember in Japan as a little girl was one that everybody smoked, and that if somebody had a cold, they would wear a mask. And I remember as a little girl thinking, well, that's a very good idea, so they don't spread their germs. And I was reminded of that today as I was wearing my mask going out. But Japan was definitely ahead of the curve on that one.
They're way ahead of us on that. Yeah, if you take a subway or in Tokyo any given day, it doesn't have to be during a coronavirus pandemic, you will see many, many people wearing masks because maybe they are ill and they just don't. It's a sense of community. They do not want to spread it to their neighbors and friends and people on the subway. Let's look at the next slide. So this is, I love this shot, and it's one of my favorites of Nick in Japan. We found a lot of these when we were doing research for the Honda book. This is Nick and Ishiro Honda, the director, on location in Japan for a scene in Frankenstein Conquers the World. I just love it because they seem so comfortable together. And as it turns out, one of the things that we learned from Honda's widow and son was that Nick and Ishiro Honda became very close. They had dinner together. Honda had Nick over to his house. And they developed a friendship over the course of the, roughly, better part of a year that they worked on these two films together. And I think that's a testament to Nick as much as anything, because again, coming over there, he had been nominated for an Academy Award. He did have a really successful Hollywood career. And instead of, playing the big man on Toho campus, he really just became part of the team. I love it.
He really is very thin, and I can see in these photos he liked his diet pills. That's sort of how and I remember my mom telling me that he was very thin over there, and that's how he stayed thin. He's kind of like Judy Garland. Did the diet pill thing.
Okay, yeah, that certainly is not healthy long term, but you got to stay fit. You got to stay fit. Yeah, he looks great. Let's see the next slide. Thank you. And again, ingratiating yourself and being respected as well as being respectful. Here's Nick. And I have to think that Henry was not far away, because this is in the middle of production. This is a lunch meeting, and I want to impress upon you who he's meeting with here. The gentleman on the far right with the plate and the suit and the glasses, that's Eiji Tsuburaya. Eiji Tsuburaya is a legend. Eiji Tsuburaya is the person who created the special effects for Godzilla and for all of these films, and he's really the father of Japanese special effects techniques. Next to him is going counterclockwise is Honda. The other gentleman who's right behind Nick and is a little bit obscured with the black suit, that's Tomoyuki Tanaka, who's the producer of all of these. He was really a higher up at the studio, and he was kind of the person who shepherded the entire Godzilla franchise through this period. So this just shows that this is amazing. I wish I knew who the person who I'm guessing maybe that's Henry Okawa, the interpreter, who's Edward's looking at the back of, because I'm sure he would have needed to be there to facilitate. But I just love stuff like this. Next picture, please. This is Monster Zero. This is the second film that Henry and Nick made together. Again, about the star caliber of the actors that he was working with in Japan. On the left of Nick is Jun Tazaki, who was a frequent cast member in the films of Akira Kurosawa, who needs no introduction. And Mr. Takarada, Akira Takarada on Nick's right, was a huge star in this time period. He was known as Mr. Handsome, and he is one of Toho's very, very biggest box office attractions. And in this film, Nick and Akira Takarada play astronauts. This is another fan favorite. This film was on television all throughout my childhood. It's known by several different names. This is the name that it was known originally when it played on television for many years. And Nick and Takarada go to a planet in our solar system that's newly discovered called Planet X. And the aliens, who you can see there on the right in those cool space suits, they double cross the Earth and end up using Godzilla and Rodan and King Ghidorah, who's known as Monster Zero, against Earth in a plot to conquer us. And Nick is the hero, really. Next slide, please. Again, another shot of Nick, Kumi Mizuno, his leading lady in these films. being directed by Honda. Allison, do we want to talk about Kumi Mizuno? There's, there were rumors, at least in the fan world, about, their involvement. Now, when you were in Japan, were you there with your whole family?
The first time he was there by himself, then we followed the second trip with my mother and my grandmother and my brother. And my grandmother went along because she knew my dad would be working all the time. So he wasn't around much because he was working. I was under the false impression because of things that my mother said that there was an involvement, but Kumi later said that my father was calling her up every night proposing to her, and she was refusing and refusing. He did fall in love with every leading lady. He definitely had that going for him. It seemed like every movie he was in, he tried to have an affair or did. But I don't remember. I mean, I have no idea. I mean, she's absolutely gorgeous when I look at her. And so I don't really know what happened.
Yeah, well, I think she kind of put the story to rest in the last several years. She's been interviewed about it several times, including with us when we did the book, and she basically said exactly what you just said. Let's take a look at the next one.
I spoke out of turn by, I think I repeated that in an interview once about, oh yeah, my mom said they were having an affair, and I had no idea, being so young, really what I was saying, or what I was, so I felt bad about that many years later when she came back and said, no, that wasn't the case. And plus there are a bunch of different customs in Japan and America. And
well, and it was a different time. It was the time of, the Mad Men era. And my mother was, she lived through that time, and she told me some stories, and it just was, there were things, I guess, that men got away with back then that they certainly shouldn't, or maybe couldn't get away with now, hopefully.
No.
Let's take a look at the next slide, please. Is this your mom?
Nope.
This is the one in the middle there. Interesting.
I don't know who that is.
Oh. All right. Well, this is obviously on the Alien set. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're getting into War of the Gargantuas, and this is Henry shaking hands again with Ishiro Honda. I'm not sure what this meeting is all about, but this is, obviously, I wonder if this is one of the first times they met. They may have met in Los Angeles. Honda would end up flying to Los Angeles several times during the mid-'60s. He was part of the team that would come over and negotiate these deals with Henry Saperstein's company and other companies that Toho was distributing films through. But these were co-productions, so it was quite a big deal. And that's, of course, Tanaka over there on the far left. Tanaka,
that's cool. I don't think I've ever seen that photo.
I love this photo, yeah. Do you recall, did he ever talk about these films with you? I mean, you kind of grew up and became, I'm not going to say you followed in his footsteps, but you followed in a related path of film journalism. And I assume you must have had discussions about all kinds of different things. But did he ever talk about these productions with you and what the circumstances were?
A little bit, but not that much, really. Is the microphone working okay? It sounds like there's a lot of feedback. Okay.
No.
More of the business aspects, I would say, because I did go to work with him at his company for quite a while in the late 80s. And so I was involved with a lot of these video licensing deals and all of that. So I would say we talked more about the sort of distribution prospects of all these. And he was just so excited every time they invented a new medium that he could relicense his products to.
Yeah.
He loved video cassettes, and then he lived, I think, just long enough to see DVDs come along, and that got him excited all over again because he could then do DVDs. And I wish he had lived to see streaming, because that would have been a big thing for him as well. So we didn't talk as much about the production. He would mention his time in Japan. I think the trip to Palau for Hell in the Pacific was what made the biggest impression on him, just because it was so remote and there were so many difficulties during filming, and they blew through so much money with John Boorman and everything that it was just, there were more anecdotes about that than anything else. Right. And I remember talking to him in Palau on some kind of shortwave telephone, and the connection crackling and going in and out, and that was I could tell how far away he was and how remote he was at that time. And then I remember he went from Palau straight to Japan after that, and I think that was to do some more business with Monster Zero and some of these films right after the production.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at the next slide. So, we talked about Nick and Kumi. Now, so I have a question about, this is a scene from War of the Gargantuas. I wish we could see it even bigger, but this is a behind the scenes kind of shot. That's director Honda on the ground demonstrating for the actress Kip Hamilton, she's kind of in the foreground. This is the scene from the War of the Gargantuas, where and I believe that's Henry off to the side there, isn't it?
It looks like it.
Mm-hmm. So he's on set during production and probably giving his input. This is the scene where
he has a cigar.
Yeah, I'm sure he does.
That's very appropriate. So so this is where the actress Kip Hamilton sings the famous song, "The Words Get Stuck in My Throat," in the nightclub, and when the song ends, it's a rooftop nightclub, and Gaila, the man-eating green gargantua, kind of wanders into the background at the height of the building, and he grabs her off the stage, and and there's a moment there where you think she's going to get eaten, but instead one of the band members shines one of the spotlights. The monster's sensitive to light, and he drops her. And so this is Honda demonstrating her falling on the ground. But in addition to the rumors about Kumi and Nick, there have also been rumors about Kip Hamilton she's only in this one scene. She's not part of the film, and it's just kind of interesting and unusual that all of a sudden an American actress comes out and sings a song. And many of the people we interviewed about Honda told us that she was like the paramour of Henry. Do you know anything about that, Pat?
I don't. I had never heard her name before until you told me. I was familiar with that scene, but I didn't remember the name of the actress in the scene. And I had never heard that name. And I asked my older sisters to see if they had heard something that I didn't remember, and they did not know anything about her either. But from the dates, it looked like she was in between marriages and he was in between marriages right around that time. So okay. It's entirely possible, but had never heard the name before. Yeah,
the idea that they weren't resentful or anything, but they thought he was throwing his weight a little around getting his girlfriend in the film.
He would not be the first or last producer to be doing that.
There you go.
But I'm surprised that I never heard him mention anything about it.
That's a classic scene, and it's been parodied and imitated in other films and even in Scooby-Doo. Let's see the next screen. So just to kind of follow up, we do have we're running a little lower on time. I just wanted to show that after his relationship with Toho on the monster films, Henry actually made a multi-picture deal with Toho, and it involved a number of different kinds of films, including what was supposed to be a spy film and a war film. The spy film ended up being What's Up, Tiger Lily, which was not an original production per se, in the sense that it was basically clips from a couple of Toho's own spy films that Woody Allen was hired, and he edited them together and redubbed it as a comedy, and it's a classic. But that's how that came about, and that was part of Toho's deal with Henry Saperstein. And Pat, you talked about Hell in the Pacific, directed by the illustrious John Boorman, and that was a problematic production, but it's a really interesting movie about these two, an American and Japanese soldier marooned together on an island. I was lucky enough to see a theatrical screening of it a few years ago. It was really fascinating. I enjoyed it very much. Next slide, please. And after that, Henry actually remained involved with Toho. He was kind of like their overseas representative for Godzilla for many years. He distributed a number of films. He actually had a small distribution company that he worked with, and a lot of these films went straight to the drive-in market in the late 60s, early 70s. Godzilla's Revenge, a very interesting children's film, very much a children's film, was originally packaged here as Minya, the son of Godzilla, but then they pulled it, or it's a little murky as to exactly how much of a release it got under that name, but it was later released and shown on television for many years as Godzilla's Revenge. The Terror of Godzilla is also known as Terror of Mechagodzilla, and Henry distributed that to matinees, and he also licensed Godzilla merchandise, as we said, and was the video. He had the video distribution rights for many years.
And he spent a lot of time releasing the Godzilla toys, because around the time I worked for him in the 80s, there started to be an explosion of imports that you could get in Little Tokyo. You could go and buy, all kinds of Godzilla toys imported straight from Japan, but they weren't supposed to be selling them unless they had gone through him and through his American licensees. So that was a constant struggle. And then there were also people just using the image of Godzilla for various things. There was a fashion designer who made a sweater with Godzilla on it that we had to send him a very strict letter saying you can't just put Godzilla on your designer sweater, without permission. And there was a famous case with the trash bags, Bagzilla, which Sears made. And my dad had to sue Sears.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. No, Toho, and I guess Henry, on behalf of Toho, have been very diligent about protecting their trademark for many years. Let's see the next slide. So I wanted to mention this. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Allison, but Nick actually stayed on and made a third film in Japan that was not a Saperstein production. He apparently had a co-production deal of his own of some kind. It's another one of these spy films that was actually part of the same series that Henry made What's Up Tiger Lily out of, and this is a film called The Killing Bottle that was made just after Monster Zero, and it's kind of it's never, to my knowledge, been made available officially outside of Japan, but it's turned up in a subtitle form in kind of like the underground market.
I know, I've never seen it.
Yeah.
Wait, is my mic sound okay?
Yeah, you sound great. Yeah,
okay. I got to tell you, it is really wonderful to see these pictures. I have not seen most of them, and it's really great. And I wish my dad knew how popular the God makes me cry. I mean, I wish you would have known, because for him, it was a kind of a low part of his career, filming abroad, even though he loved working and loved making these movies. But the fact that they became cult classics and that he has these fans and people all over the world, they just love these movies. And it's great. People like you are keeping it alive as well. So thank you very much for showing me these pictures.
Yeah, no, it's a joy to look at them with you and to talk about them. And I'm sure Henry would have, like I said, felt the same way. This is something that he worked so hard to shepherd, and he had obstacles, and now a lot of those barriers have been removed, and the floodgates have opened to a certain extent.
He would have loved this, yeah.
I'm sure he would have. Let's look at the next one, because there's a couple of other things I want to look at. After Nick, came back from Japan, he made a couple more things. I believe this is his last film, or last feature film, but certainly one of them. Can we talk just briefly about, he didn't, there were always kind of like questions around how his life ended, which was tragic. And certainly, he was, by all appearances, he was still going strong, but his career continued to kind of, be pushed toward the margins. And this is a smaller production. I believe he shot a film in Mexico. You mentioned Die Monster Die, which was made in the UK. So can you fill us in a little bit on what happened there?
What happened
Well,
where.
you know, toward the end of his life, and you know where he went career-wise and personally.
Oh, well, you have to read my next book. Um,
Okay.
uh, it was it. Well, this picture, first of all, practically ruined his relationship with Bob Conrad and John Ashley. They were so mad at him because he started this raging affair with Marianne Mobley, and everybody's dead. I guess I can speak frankly. And he became obsessed with her, and this was going to be Young Dillinger was going to be these three guys movie. This was going to be their big one. This was going to be the comeback and the whole thing. And then he took up with Marianne Mobley, and they were furious. It ended up being, it's on YouTube. There's a scene of them too where he slaps her. I think it's called one of the worst movie scenes ever made or something. So this was definitely not a highlight. And I remember Marianne. Actually, my dad would drive over in his robe and go visit her. And I remember her, and she gave me these cute little dolls and this mouse house. I remember her teaching me how to toss a salad. I mean, I have very fond memories of her. She was very, very sweet, but definitely came between he and his buddies when they made this movie. And I don't know if anybody's ever heard that story before, but Bob Conrad, when I saw him, it was probably 8 years ago in Los Angeles, and he gave me some dirt about that. And he was still mad about this movie this many years later about what my dad did. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, he passed not long after this, isn't that correct? So.
He did. Mm-hmm. Well, he passed in 1968. And, he and my mother had been going through quite a long, tumultuous divorce and custody battle. So, and I think it was very hard on him personally. One of the great things about publishing The Rebel and the King, when I found the manuscript that my father had written about his time in with Elvis Presley in 1956, is I traveled to Memphis and Tupelo and met a lot of people, and I learned even what Elvis said and what he did when he learned my father died. And so I published the book to really kind of bring some peace to the mystery of his overdose and how he died. And I really did get some answers and heard some pretty good stories too. So, but it was definitely not a great time, although both Elvis and both Robert Conrad said that my father was on the swing. He was on the upswing. He had come back from Rome, from Italy. The film had gotten canceled, but he still was working out. So one of the reasons why I wrote the book is because there's always been this misconception that he committed suicide, and I don't believe that he did. He was a fighter. He was a professional. He loved what he did. He loved us. I don't believe that he killed himself. And I feel like that's one of the things that has been a real misconception about my father and his death, is that I don't think he killed himself. So.
Well, I want to just mention to our audience out there, we are running, we're about to run over just a little bit. There are other programs happening on our YouTube channel. Just to be aware, there's things happening on the hour. So I don't want to step on anybody's toes, so we should probably wrap up soon. Let's look at the next slide, please. This is the Rebel and the King, the book that Allison mentioned. It's available through Amazon, and I highly recommend it. You mentioned it's a manuscript that you discovered that you didn't know was available? Or
no, there was a lot I didn't know about my father's life and career, and literally 45 years after his death, I opened this box and found this manuscript about his friendship with Elvis Presley. And I really expected to be very bummed out when I opened the box and find all these, and I found this manuscript. And it's really cool because it is the last glimpse of innocence before the end of an era. It's right at the beginning of Elvis's career. It was kind of like the city mouse and the country mouse. They were both poor. They were great buddies, and he was right in the middle of Elvis's explosion. It was wonderful to find, and my father wrote it, and he used to write a lot of articles about his celebrity friends with their permission, and so it was a great find to find it. The book we have an expanded version now, so that's the first one. I have a second edition.
You mentioned he was a writer. He did write actually an article that was published in the LA newspapers about his experiences working on the Japanese monster films, and he was quite an advocate for them. He was quite enthusiastic. The next slide, please.
What was that called? I've never heard that.
It was in the LA Herald Examiner. You remember the Herald Examiner?
Mm-hmm.
The old newspaper. Yeah, it was published, I guess, around 1965 or 66. And I'd be glad to find it and share it with you. Yeah.
I will.
And this is a book that is about the history of UPA Studios and has a lot of information about Saperstein's career. And it was published a number of years ago from Wesleyan University Press. Pat, as far as Henry's legacy is concerned, his company obviously closed and the properties went elsewhere. But he contributed so much. And do you know, has there ever been talk of a more of a straight biography of his life and his career?
Not really, but it's certainly an interesting idea because the properties that he was involved with were so eclectic and odd in a way. If you look at the Timothy Leary documentary, working with Elvis Presley, the various animation properties, and Godzilla, it's quite a combination of programming. So I think it would be kind of fun. And then going back to his childhood when his father ran movie theaters in Chicago, and that was the day when the mob controlled the movie theaters. And he had some stories, possibly apocryphal, but who knows, about the gangsters and, as a kid being kind of held hostage for the projectionists to pay off the mobsters and everything. And it's true that they were very, very tied into the movie projectionist union. So some of that must have been true. And then learning how to run a movie theater with his dad just in the 30s. When his dad died very young and left him several movie theaters to manage in Chicago. So I think that could be interesting.
I do too. It's a time that is, long gone, but there are amazing stories that have yet to be, discovered and told.
And just combing through the Variety archives, I find all kinds of fascinating things. When he first announced Frankenstein Conquers the World and some of the other films, he announced all kinds of other crazy films that, of course, never got made, but that he had all kinds of ideas for other productions that he said he was going to be making, and that was printed in Variety at the time. So it's fun discovering those kind of things.
Godzilla went away for many years. There were times when the films ceased production. And, if you're a fan of these things, you're kind of wishing they would come back. And there was an announcement that part of it was relayed in Starlog or Fangoria. Was it Starlog? Fangoria magazine in the 70s, where Saperstein announced a film called Godzilla versus the Devil. And we all got so excited about that. Of course, it never happened. But yeah, but that's a great title, too, that he, I can imagine him, dreaming that one up. I don't think there's evidence that the project ever went very far, but that's really part of the showmanship that he was so good at.
I think it might have been the Devil Fish. I remember seeing an article about my dad announcing these titles, And I thought one of them might have been devilfish. I don't have the article with me, but
But the devilfish is in Frankenstein Conquers the World. They that's the big end scene with the octopus. Yeah, the giant octopus. It's classic.
okay.
It's actually a kind of like a what you call it, a lost scene kind of ending, and an alternate ending that was rediscovered after some time. It's fascinating. Yeah. Oh, thank you so very much, both of you, Pat and Allison, for sharing these stories and spending time with us today. It's a real pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank
Great
you
to
very
meet
much,
you, Allison.
Steve. Great to meet you too.
Bye-bye.
And I just want to remind everybody to look at our YouTube page, our website, kaijumastersclass.com, to stay abreast of all the programming that's going on all day, today and tomorrow. And thank you guys for a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for watching. And this will be archived on YouTube in perpetuity, hopefully. Take care now.
Great.
Great. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.